Hemingway wrote that in 1929, he had been wounded in war, broken by love, destroyed by loss. He wasn't offering comfort. He was making a precise observation about what happens to the structure of mind that survives being broken more than once. Most people treat resilience as a personality trait, something you either have or you don't, something the strong possess and the weak lack. But the research on this, accumulated over decades across cultures and catastrophes, tells a different story. Resilience is not a trait, it is a process. And like every process, it can be understood, it can be observed, and critically, it can be learned. When life breaks a person once, the mind has a natural recovery mechanism. Grief runs its course. Shock gives way to processing. The nervous system, given time and safety, returns to something like equilibrium. But when life breaks a person repeatedly, loss followed by loss, setback following setback, crisis arriving before the previous one is healed, something different happens. The mind begins to update its model of reality, not temporarily, structurally. It begins to expect the next break before it arrives. And that expectation changes everything. Psychologists call this anticipatory stress. The chronic activation of the threat response not in response to what is happening, but in response to what the mind has learned to expect. The person who has been broken repeatedly doesn't just carry the memory of past breaks. They carry a neural architecture shaped by those breaks. Their baseline, the state the nervous system returns to between events, has shifted. And that shifted baseline is the real cost of repeated adversity, not the events themselves, but what the mind becomes in their aftermath. And this is the first thing to understand about a mind that has been broken repeatedly. The breaks are not the problem. The breaks are the data. Every break contains information about what the mind believed, what expected, what it was not prepared for. A mind that learns to read that information is not a mind that avoids future breaks. It is a mind that processes them differently. The dominant cultural narrative about resilience is built around a single image: the person who doesn't break, who absorbs hit after hit without showing damage, who gets up faster than anyone else, who never lets it affect them. This image is not only wrong, it is actively harmful because it conflates resilience with rigidity. And rigidity, in biological systems, in psychological systems, in any system under repeated stress, is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of imminent fracture. Material scientists have a term for this: brittleness. A brittle material doesn't bend under stress. It holds its form until suddenly it doesn't, until the accumulated pressure reaches a threshold and the material fails completely. The opposite of brittleness is not hardness. It is flexibility, the capacity to deform under pressure and return to form, or, in the most sophisticated systems, to deform under pressure and emerge with a different, more functional form. The person who has learned to perform resilience, who presents an unbroken surface to the world while carrying unprocessed fractures beneath, is not resilient. They are brittle, and the mind that has never been allowed to break openly, to process visibly, to be genuinely destabilized, is a mind that has never developed the actual mechanisms of recovery. It has only developed the performance of recovery, which collapses the moment the next break arrives. In the aftermath of September 11, 2001, psychologist George Bonanno began studying what actually happens to people after catastrophic loss. His findings challenged almost everything the mental health field had assumed. He found that the majority of people exposed to even severe trauma did not develop PTSD. They did not require years of therapy to recover. They showed what Bonanno called a resilience trajectory, a relatively stable level of functioning maintained throughout the period of adversity. Not because they were special, not because they were strong, but because resilience, Bonanno found, is the norm, not the exception. But Bonanno's research also found something else. The people who struggled most after repeated adversity were not those who had been exposed to the most. They were those whose recovery from previous breaks had been interrupted by new crises arriving too quickly, by environments that didn't allow processing, by the internalized belief that showing the break was a sign of weakness. Recovery from adversity, Bonanno concluded, is not primarily about strength. It is about the availability of certain conditions. And the most critical of those conditions is time and the permission to use it. Post-traumatic growth, the documented phenomenon of people emerging from severe adversity with greater psychological sophistication, deeper relationships, and a more nuanced relationship with meaning, is not the result of the adversity itself. It is the result of the processing of adversity, of the deliberate, uncomfortable work of examining what broke, why it broke, and what the break reveals about what was there before. The break is not the teacher. The examination of the break is the teacher. History's most psychologically sophisticated minds were rarely those who had been protected from adversity. They were, almost without exception, those who had been broken repeatedly and had developed a capacity to use the break as information. Dostoevsky was sentenced to death, reprieve at the last moment, spent 4 years in a Siberian prison camp, and emerged to write the works that would reshape how humans understand suffering. Lincoln lost 8 elections before becoming president, buried 2 children, led a nation through its most catastrophic internal fracture, and wrote some most psychologically precise observations about grief and persistence ever recorded. These were not people who were unaffected by their breaks. They were people who allowed the breaks to teach them something they could not have learned any other way. The Japanese aesthetic concept of kintsugi captures something that Western culture has systematically failed to understand about resilience. When a ceramic bowl breaks, kintsugi repairs it with gold, not to hide the break, but to make the break visible. To treat the fracture as part of the object's history, as evidence of its survival, not its failure. The repaired bowl is not pretending the break didn't happen. It is incorporating the break into its structure, and in doing so, it becomes something that the unbroken bowl could never have been. Viktor Frankl, writing after surviving 4 concentration camps, described what he called the defiant power of the human spirit, the capacity of the mind, even under conditions of absolute external destruction, to choose its relationship to what is happening. He didn't describe this as heroism. He described it as a skill, one that he had observed developing in people over the course of repeated adversity, not despite the breaks. Through them, there is a cost to being broken repeatedly without learning what the break is trying to teach. It doesn't always show up as collapse. More often, it shows up as contraction. The person who has been broken enough times without developing resilience doesn't become dramatically destroyed. They become smaller. They stop attempting things that might break them again. They build walls that are really just the avoidance of the next break. They confuse self-protection with self-preservation. And in doing so, they preserve a life that is progressively less lived. Psychologist Martin Seligman observed this pattern in his research on learned helplessness. Animals and humans, who are repeatedly exposed to adverse events they cannot control, eventually try to escape. Even when escape becomes possible, they have learned, neurologically, that effort is futile, that the break is inevitable, that trying to prevent it only adds exhaustion to injury. But Seligman also observed something else, something that received far less attention. Learned helplessness is reversible. The nervous system that has learned futility can unlearn it, not through motivation, not through inspiration, but through the specific experience of agency restored, of discovering, in one small domain, that action produces outcome, that the break is not the end of the story. And this is the pattern that separates the mind that grows from breaks from a mind that is only diminished by them. It is not resilience in the sense of not breaking. It is resilience in the sense of what the mind does with the break, whether it treats the break as evidence that it cannot survive, or as information about what it is made of, whether the break becomes a wall or a teacher. That choice, slow, non-linear, never guaranteed, is where resilience actually lives, not in the absence of breaking, but in what the mind learns to do in the aftermath. Life will break you. That is not a failure of life or a failure of you. It is what life does. The question has never been whether the break will come. The question is what the mind is doing with each break as it arrives, whether it is filing it as evidence of fundamental fragility, or whether it is reading it carefully, honestly, without drama, as information about what needs to change, what needs to be built differently, what it now knows that it could not have known before. The mind that survives repeated breaking is not the mind that was never broken. It is the mind that learns something different from each break. Not stronger in the sense of harder. Stronger in the sense of Hemingway's phrase, strong at the broken places. You were not broken by what happened. You were broken open. Those are not the same thing. Inner observer. Observe your mind. Understand reality.